Welcome to the Encounter Faith podcast. My name is Ross, and I am so grateful to be able to have these conversations with some of my favorite people each and every week. And one of my favorite people, Max Schiewe, is here. Max, welcome back to the podcast. It's been a minute.
Thank you. It has been a hot minute.
And I want you to know that even though you haven't been returning my calls, I still consider you one of my favorite people.
That's fair enough. Yeah, I let those go straight to voicemail.
Yeah.
Tend not to bother myself with your voice more than I need to.
This is going to be fun. Where we are going to talk about today, as folks are hearing this, Max, we are coming up on Easter. They might be hearing this during Holy Week. They might be hearing this after. That's how the internet works, Max. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but I want to have this conversation in the real world timeline as much as possible, because I think it's helpful for people to hear from a variety of our communicators what the value of this season is. So to start with a pretty broad question, I'm curious how you articulate to folks, particularly folks who maybe are newer to the faith, the value of the season that we've just walked through of Lent. Because the way I described it recently was, if you wake up on an Easter morning and you Google Easter services near me, like, that's great. I'm not judging that at all. But there's a richness and a value to what we've just all been through over the past 40-ish days, depending on when you're hearing this. But how do you articulate that? Yeah.
So the season of Lent, I feel like, at least growing up for me, I certainly didn't understand it. And it's a pretty popular perception out there that Lent is just sort of this weird ritual that we do where we do a little bit of moral grandstanding and project these things that we're giving up without really any intention behind it. It's just, right, I'm going to give this thing up because it is vaguely healthy for me. You get a lot of those goodbye posts on social media back in the day for me. Like right. A lot of people being like, I'll see you at Easter. Yeah. See you on the other side, in 41 days. But there's some more purpose to Lent than that. It's good for us to be able to give something up. But the whole purpose behind it is not just for some degree of self-improvement.
Sure.
The season of Lent exists for the church to reflect deeply, more so than even the rest of the year, on the death and resurrection of Christ. This whole idea of us having a liturgical calendar or a common lectionary across the church, that it's not just something that's been purposelessly passed down from century to century to century. There's a great deal of an intentionality behind it. And in Lent specifically, we don't just arrive at Easter Sunday every year and say, he's risen, hallelujah, this is great, here's the hymns I remember from my childhood, and that's that. But Easter Sunday arrives at this moment in the narrative, right? And the season of Lent helps us to walk that narrative, to see how we arrive at the cross, how we deal with the aftermath of the cross, and how the resurrection is this climactic moment coupled along with the cross. That resurrection doesn't just happen out of nowhere, but it happens because, Christ had to suffer and die to bring forgiveness to the many. And so Lent allows us to focus in on that more keenly.
Sure.
Where each and every week, it's like there's something different that I'm feeling gratitude for, that the cross and the resurrection has brought about. Yeah, it's not just this historical figure that did something miraculous, but there is, in our understanding of the narrative, we can be led to real, tangible things that affect our lives, that we can meditate on and be thankful for. And so, I guess that kind of very long-winded, but that encapsulates my concept now of what the Lenten season is.
No, it's good. I'm glad you started with what it was for you as a kid, because one of the things that stands out to me about your position within our church and your ministry up to this point anyway is a lot of your context here. You're right. You're working with our middle school students. And I'm curious, there's, I think, a cliche that gets applied upon that generation or a younger generation, even someone like you, where we like to think that because we are in this sort of immediate culture, the microwave culture, or whatever sort of label you want to put to it, the slow walk of things are hard, but when you get it, it feels deeply meaningful. Having 40 days before anything these days is wild. You know, you hear about a summer blockbuster movie and you've seen most of the movie in the 4 or 5 different trailers for it that get released in lead up to it. We aren't very good at waiting. I'm curious, do you feel like that assumption that older generations have applied to younger generations about both not being good at waiting, but also just like the sort of almost patronizing, like once they get it, they'll see how valuable it is? Does that play out, or is there a different way that older generations should be looking at younger generations?
Well, I think there's a case to be made on both sides
Sure.
of that coin. Middle school students, I know this might sound obvious to some, but they're not always as dumb as some people like to think they are.
I think it's a great way of looking at it.
They do have a capacity to understand things. But again, as we've talked about before, you know, I'm not going to go up and give them a seminar about church history
Sure.
and what
atonement theory
and how you should partake in these various high churchy traditions.
Sure.
A lot of them, they haven't grown up with that, but also that's not how they engage well with the faith. Their faith exists less at an intellectual level and more at the ground level. Mm-hmm. How is this impacting the things I deal with today? Mm-hmm. And the way we kind of enter into that space and help them navigate it is by being relational. Like, I'm going to walk into your small group with no preset agenda and just figure out through hearing your experience, what does Christ mean to you right now? What are you struggling with right now? And that gives me the chance to see, okay, here is how the cross of Christ enters into where they're hurting or where they're struggling. Here's how this applies. It's not just, my 3 universal bullet points that I'm going to give to every kid.
Right.
Because that's not how they learn best. But again, being willing to hear their perspective, what their immediate concerns are, like the theology of the cross, yes, it exists at a very intellectual level, being the fullest revelation of God's character. Luther has a lot to say about it. But also it is a very practical sort of thing. That the cross is something that applies to our lives here and now. Something about understanding the character of God changes how I think and how I live today. Changes how I feel or don't feel God's presence today.
Sure.
On the flip side of that, there is something to be said about how the generation raised entirely on technology can have a harder time maintaining a central sort of focus. And I wouldn't say this is a fault of their own. No, for sure. But the content that the algorithm, if I were to name a vague kind of boogeyman, their TikTok algorithm is always just, and this applies to adults too.
Oh, for sure.
Always sending out this crazy stuff. Kids are coming in and they'll ask questions like, I saw some preacher on TikTok say that this sign means that the end times are upon us.
Oh, great.
You're
having
right.
Eschatological?
Yes.
Yes.
Very sensationalistic.
Love that
content that is meant to kind of gin up a little bit of fear and concern.
Sure.
And so I feel for the kids in that regard, that this is the kind of stuff they're being pushed. It's hard for them, and it's hard for adults too, to discern what preaching I see on the internet is good teaching and what is not, what's sensationalistic. And so the helpful part of walking them through Lent there is that we recenter.
Yeah.
Yes, we're all over the place in our teaching. We're walking through the whole of the biblical narrative. But during Lent, we're reminded that amidst all of the background noise, amidst all of these different theological positions that folks in the outside world hold, we center our faith first on the person and work of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And that is revealed to us most fully in his death and resurrection.
Yeah, that's good, man. That's a good word. Because I think one of the things that stands out to me as an opportunity, if we shift this a little bit, thinking about Easter, the amount of people who are going to come into our building, the building of whatever church you go to, dear listener, on Easter reflects a level of opportunity for the church to show up for folks. But when we show up for folks with the sense of condemnation, I remember talking to Pastor Greg, and Pastor Greg makes this big point about, like, if you're here twice a year, great. I'm just glad you're here. And I don't even think he realized the amount of good that someone like him saying that can do for people who are expecting to be judged. And I think similarly, what you're describing is when we approach an age group, I love that you said middle schoolers aren't as dumb as a lot of people think they are, with a expectation of limiting the cross and the significance of it. We rob them of that opportunity to be centered. We rob them of that opportunity to experience the fullness of the faith. And what I'm curious about is when I think about that in the context of Easter, Easter there's parts of Easter that can feel pretty programmatic, pretty routine. A lot of people listening have their sort of set Easter traditions. And what I'm curious about is whether it's in your own life or in a ministry context, like, what does it look like to be able to embrace some of those traditions without having them become routine or having them become idols, where we are more focused on the tradition in this context of Lent itself or of Easter itself, rather than the significance of what these are supposed to represent?
Yeah, I would say a popular pushback, some people will just ignore tradition outright.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's what we're aiming for here. Tradition, when we engage with it intentionally, is great. Mm-hmm. Many traditions have been passed down to us for a reason. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you think about the early church, before there was a super cohesive and completed New Testament canon, the way that the faith and worship was passed down from generation to generation was through this idea of written and oral tradition.
Yep.
That's how it was passed down, but there was an intentionality behind it. It wasn't just a set of empty gestures. Mm-hmm. We had, the early church had heard the words of Christ, had heeded them, and saw these as fit to pass down, that we engage with our faith and our worship in certain ways. To another point that you mentioned, I really, really love the idea of being able to emphasize that the church can show up for people at a time like Easter. Because the church doesn't just exist to recruit. Mm-hmm. That's not what we're here to do at a time like Easter.
Right.
First and foremost, we want people to understand the idea of the victory of Christ. What does that mean for them? Victory over sin and death and evil. But then in light of that, the church exists to advocate for other people, to reflect God's victory over these things, to reflect his goodness out into the world. And so when we engage with our Easter traditions, that's what we have in mind. Mm. I am going to the same service I go to every year and going to the same family brunch I go to every year with gratitude in mind for all that Christ has done for me, and with a challenge on my heart of some way of, okay, how do I engage in this mission of showing up for other people as Christ's representatives, his body here on earth?
That's good, man. And it's the kind of thing that not to get too on the nose with it, but I feel like the pastors that I'm most drawn to are those who, I don't think it's accidental. It's those who have had experience within youth ministry. And I think what that forces any pastor to do, whether they stay in youth ministry or not, is it forces a sense of leading with a relationship, and therefore leading with, I don't say no expectation, but like pretty minimal expectation, because you know what, in your case, you know what those kids are capable of because you know those kids. And I think too often those of us who aren't pastors try a different model that isn't actually working. We try to assume, well, I'm going to invite my coworkers to Easter because that's what I'm supposed to do as a good Christian, rather than knowing your coworkers and being able to, and again, not about recruiting, but being able to extend invites in a way that's actually relationally helpful, rather than ultimately creating stumbling blocks for people. Where that leads me to then is when I think about one of the messages you most recently delivered in context as people are hearing this, you were talking about the beauty of Christ. And again, it's this inherent sense of contradiction. At the cross, we have this grotesque torture. And yet that scene is the most replicated, famous depiction of art in any moment in history in any time in the world. Can you help folks understand some of what, like the diving deeper that you did in the context of that message, but ultimately how we are meant to respond to that beauty? Because I think for so many of us, especially the folks who are listening, we've allowed that beauty itself, or the cross itself, probably is a better way of saying that, to become routine.
Yeah, I think for me, the depth of study here is that the cross is not just the centerpiece of a singular theory of atonement.
What is a theory of atonement?
Theory of atonement essentially meaning we understand the cross as the place where our sins were forgiven.
Sure.
How does that happen? How does a man 2,000 years ago dying on a Roman torture cross lead to our sins being forgiven? So that's what I mean when I'm talking about atonement theories. And there's different ones out there. The idea of substitutionary atonement, like Christ standing in our place. The idea of Christus Victor, meaning Christ at the cross is victorious over sin, death, and evil. The idea of deification or theosis, meaning that at the cross we are invited to join into the divine life. We're invited to join into God's work of restoring the divine image among humanity and among creation. All sorts of different atonement theories. But to me, the depth of study is that the cross represents a great reversal of things in so many other ways. Yes, we kind of put to bed the old system of sacrificial atonement when Christ himself stands in as our sacrifice. But in terms of the way we live, the way we act, the systems we engage in now, Christ at the cross reverses a lot of those things.
Yeah.
So in the idea of, you would think somebody hanging on a cross is grotesque, but actually there's beauty in that. There's a reversal going on there. The idea that Christ, an innocent man, was accused and blamed for all of these things, yet he comes back into the world and doesn't take up the station of an accuser, but rather one of an advocate. There's a great reversal going on there.
Yeah, that's good.
And so to me, that is the depth of study, that, again, the cross is not just an intellectual exercise, but it all adds a layer on with what we call this theology of presence.
Sure.
The idea that God is present among his people.
That's good.
And as we walk through Lent, we see all these things, Jesus being present with people during his ministry. We celebrate at the table every week we reflect on the Last Supper and the crucifixion, that in the bread and the wine, in the body and the blood, Christ's real presence is there with us. And then in the resurrection, Christ is present with his people again and promises that his Spirit will be present with us. And the tie-in to how any of this sort of practically applies is that this theology of presence is meant to be an example.
Yeah, that's good.
To how the church is meant to act and evangelize. It is not just me knowing these certain words. I understand what atonement theory is. Jesus died for my sins. Come hear about this on Sunday. Yes, that's a piece of it, but the way we get from point A to point B, where that becomes effective, where that those words are heard and received, is when we are present with people.
That's good.
When we care for them, when we model for them the goodness of God that we've had this time to reflect on in Lent.
That's good. Where I want to leave things, one of the things that I'm mindful of is there's a group of people who are listening to this, and this is the first, I'll use the phrase, heads up they've had about Easter. This is like they're checking back in with their faith, or they are exploring their faith. A lot of those people wind up coming to church probably twice a year. A lot of those people are walking around with a sense of, man, there is something else that is missing, but maybe not necessarily knowing the language. And I'll be the first to say the reason why is because the church has allowed that gap to grow. But what I'm curious about is, what message would you have for the person who comes to an Easter service where the physical act of going to church is a victory all on its own? A different way of asking that is like, what is the right expectation for Easter for that type of person?
I mean, the right expectation, I think where I'd start is, Easter's this celebration of the victory of God and the presence of God that is going to remain with us. And so the first thing is that those truths are just as true for the person who's been coming here every week since the mid-90s and the person who's coming for the first time this upcoming week.
That's good.
That God has not forgotten about you. We see at the cross that God cares about bringing his people back near to him. Nice. That God has not forsaken his people. That applies to that person too. There is not a system of Christian brownie points that's, kind of getting tallied up over the course of the year.
Yeah.
If you fill out a prayer card, you get 1 gold star.
Nice.
If you buy something from the cafe, you get 5 more heaven points.
Right. If you click on one of the emails that Ross sends out, you get 20, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, you might.
You get 20 worship
points. You should probably do that. You guys should stop.
I should incentivize. I should gamify
stop
this episode that way.
Ignoring what he sends to you. But that's beyond the point. The first expectation is that Jesus Christ himself will meet you there. Nice. He will meet you where you're at. He has not forgotten about you. He does not view you as lesser. None of that. And likewise, the church should not either.
Yeah.
So for the person who gets a little grumpy about, man, maybe my normal seat in the pew was taken, or I have to walk a few more parking spot lengths than I usually do.
Yep.
I don't want to sound too crass or judgmental, but I would say maybe take some time in some gentle prayer with the outcome of getting over your own ego.
For sure.
A little bit there. Because Easter Sunday is not just about your own enjoyment, right? Yes, there's a part, and I've mentioned it throughout this whole episode, that we get to reflect personally on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, but also our response to that and engaging in God's mission. Like, man, those words would ring really hollow to an outsider if they see a bunch of seasoned Christian veterans who, are too busy trying to hold other people's place in line than they are concerned about being just human and welcoming other people into the building for the first time.
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, you and I just started an entirely separate podcast, but like, that is such a good word. I think particularly because that is the type of stuff that's easy, right? Like, I've maintained for a long time, one of the benefits of being an adult convert, as I am coming to the family as an adult, is you remember what it's like to not be a Christ follower. And the reality is the vast majority of you listening have always been a part of the church. You have stories like my wife. You've been a part of the church in some way, shape, or form as a kid. Maybe you had a season of walking away, but in general, you've been a part of the church for a long time. The reason that is true is because after study, that's why we put such a heavy emphasis on, ministry between the ages of 4 and 14, because if you become someone who follows Jesus during that time frame, you are statistically most likely to continue to do so in adulthood. So if that is your story, I would say take it from someone like me and take it from Max's word, that the simple act of being willing to participate in church when you have to sit in a different pew or your favorite seat is taken actually does quite a bit to combat some of the narrative that is outside of the church about the church. And every single person listening, especially if you're still listening, you already know how to do that. Max, Schiewe, thank you very much, man. This was the exact type of thing I was looking for to wrap up our conversations around Lent. So thank you for being here. And for everybody, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
See you guys later.